Okay, today I wanted to talk about rendering floor plans using Photoshop. And there's a couple things we need to figure out when we are rendering floor plans. The biggest thing is that floor plans are typically printed to scale. Now, we are working in an electronic world, and all we have are really electrons and pixels. So one of the first things you need to think about is when you're working, this is a SketchUp model. But you can do this in Revit as well, or any other architectural program. You have to think about how are you going to get this out of the software, which is in 3 dimensions, right? This is a 3D model. How are you going to get it out in a floor plan mode that you can then fiddle around with in Photoshop and retain the scale? Now, typically, if you're scanning an object, and I'm just going to call up my scanner window here, um, you'll put a physical drawing on the scanner bed, and the scanner will do a preview, and you can adjust the size of the area that you're going to crop, and the system knows that it has a physical size. See how the size is right here? You can choose the resolution. It's not really dots per inch, it's actually pixels per inch. And pixels are a measure of dimension of electronic image files. In fact, we can even tell this drawing here, the scanner, to measure the image in pixels. What we get at 300 pixels per inch is an image that's about 2094 pixels. If I change the resolution of the scanner, I get more pixels. More pixels means a more precise image. Now, of course, this is a scanner. We don't have a scanner. We can't scan our screen, not very successfully anyway. But the principle remains the same. The more pixels you have, the better off you are. The only problem is that when we go to export images from our software, and I'll go back to SketchUp here, it doesn't really understand physical size so much as it does pixels. So I'm going to go and export a 2D graphic from SketchUp. Of course, if you're in Revit, there are other export options. Either way, I'm going to go to the options here and choose the image size here. If you're just totally confused by the whole pixels thing, you can absolutely change this to inches. And let's change both of these to inches and change our resolution here. And what you will see is it will figure out how many pixels that needs to be at, say, 55 inches by 28 inches. And if you don't need it that big, of course, maybe you'll just get this a little smaller. Okay. The only problem is none of these numbers tell us how to print this to scale. They don't reference the scale of the drawing. You could try printing to a PDF from either SketchUp or Layout or Revit, whichever program you're using, set it up to scale and print it to a high quality PDF. That will preserve the scale of the image, but usually not everybody has layout, and more often than not when you're exporting these images, you're just going with pixel size. So my advice is if you divide this number in pixels by about 200, you'll get about how big the image will print precisely. So for a floor plan that's going to be, say, 20 inches wide, we might want to go with about 4,000 pixels to make sure it's sharp enough. Okay. Now, I'm going to not export this right now. Really, the best way to export from SketchUp is to make sure that you put the file into a layout project. And here I have a layout file. And there you can, once the model is in that project, if you've set up your drawing to be orthographic, from the top view, then you can just set it to one of the standard scales. Now that it's in layout and the scale is set correctly, you can just export this guy as a PDF file. Just choose PDF file, and again, with every export operation, you can choose the resolution. With a floor plan, absolutely choose the highest resolution, the lowest amount of distortion or highest quality. Once you do that, that image file that you create, a PDF is basically an image file, will remember that it is exactly the correct size for your work. The other thing that I like to do, because again there's sometimes confusion about getting these drawings to scale, is I like to put a graphic scale. This is actually a component in SketchUp that you can move around. That graphic scale, of course, is to scale, and that way when you export the image file of your floor plan, the scale will go with it, which means that if you mess up somehow with your math, if somewhere along the way you accidentally change the image size, at least the graphic scale will be resized with the image. All right, so let's quit out of SketchUp, and I'm not going to save that, and we'll go to our friends over at Photoshop. And here I have a Photoshop document with a number of layers that I've created from my original document. And I believe I used Revit to create most of these, although actually I have a couple from SketchUp just to show you. Revit, if you're not familiar, it does have some sketchy line options in it. I exported one plan view with some sketchy lines, one view with just the furniture. And again, you can do this in SketchUp or Revit by hiding other elements. Typically, I isolate the furniture because I like to have a shadow on it, and you can't really do that when everything else is around. I also had the flooring in here. Not sure how I'm going to work my rendering here, so just have a couple of layers to experiment with. Another sketchy plan. Here's just a sharp version of the walls. Again, I can put a drop shadow in there if I want. I have a rendered view of the floor plan. Again, sometimes the rendering comes out pretty well out of Revit, but it lacks some of the definition that you get when you have a rendered view of the plan. It loses the line work. Sometimes the shadows don't have a proper definition. So I treat that as another sort of layer in my palette. If you would rather, SketchUp also has a lot of graphic control, a little more than in Revit, so you can get some more sketchy sketch lines in SketchUp. This one's a marker, I believe, and white on black. So, you know, there's a few more toys to play with when you are using SketchUp. Anyway, and then I have a blurred view of the main floor plan. So let's just start here. First of all, whenever you import images, whenever you place images in a Photoshop document, you know, you're going to open these all up and place them in here. So you go to the File, pull-down menu, and Place Embedded. What it will do is it still kind of links back to that original file. So you want to rasterize that layer. What that does is it just converts it to pixels that exist in this Photoshop document, which make it easy to modify. All right, now I'm going to start with just this drawing here that's fully rendered to show you an example of the simplest form of rendering, which is really you just take an already rendered image and add back in some of the things that you think might be missing. In this case, maybe I'll add in the lines, which are nice and dark. But of course, when I turn that layer on, this one that says Revit Plan Walls, it blocks out the layer below. To make it show through, you can use this blending mode. So I've selected the layer, and I choose this blending mode here. There's one called Multiply, and what that does is anything that is black in this layer becomes completely opaque. No pixels show through it. Anything that's white becomes completely clear. It basically disappears and shows all the pixels of whatever's below it. And then if something is gray, it shows it based on the percentage of grayness. So when I choose that, you see how my plan shines through very nicely. I even get some funky dashed lines in there. I still think the plan is a little bit heavy for my use. Now, if I start modifying this plan, I better make a copy of it so that I don't mess up the original, because I never know if I'm going to mess it up badly or not. So all you do is right-click on the layer and choose Duplicate. And of course, it will be called Copy. I'm going to turn off the original. Now on this copy, the simplest thing you can do is just drop the opacity down, and that tends to soften the layer just a little bit, tends to soften the rendering, because often these renderings are just a little bit too aggressive in their coloration. The density of the pixels is a bit strong. Another little trick that you can do to soften it is you can select an area and just render a small swatch. Maybe I'll use a polygonal lasso here, and I'll just select, say, a small swath to render here. And maybe I will even feather it. By right-clicking on the selection, I can choose this feather option. Feathering softens the perimeter of that selection. And now on this copy, if I just delete that section, you see how I can leave a section that's unrendered? Now, I don't really like it that way. I think I want to reverse that. I want to select all the other parts of this colored image and delete those. And now I can just have one section of the plan that is rendered. And you know, that tends to be a little less graphically heavy on your boards. And you can even use other selection tools to trim this out to give it a sharper look, if you prefer. Now, obviously, this is one very simple technique, and I really didn't even do all that much to this rendered plan, but you can see that already that's a much softer view than this. This is really a dense image on your board. It's a lot harder to talk about than if you just have a small swatch that's rendered. Okay. Now, another thing that people like to do is they like to use that colored rendered image. Let me turn this back on. But they use a similar technique on this layer. They try to have this blurred background. Again, you can lower the opacity so it's a little softer. But then you can come in and turn back on something like the furniture. And again, maybe a blending mode will work for me here. Whoops, wrong layer. Turn back on the furniture, and when you overlay that sharp furniture and the sharp walls with the blurred area, that also can look very nice. Now, let's say you want the furniture to have even more definition. I can come back in here and go back to my normal blending mode. But maybe if I get rid of all this white area so that just the furniture is white, that'll really emphasize it. To do that, I need to use the Magic Wand tool. I like the Magic Wand tool. And the way it works is when you click on a pixel, it tries to select every pixel that looks just like the one that you clicked on. So if I click over here, this is a white area. Now, right now, when I click on that, what you'll see is it's basically selected every area that touched that original pixel that is white. That's because I have this contiguous button checked. If I didn't, and I went here and did this, now it would select every white pixel on the screen. I could also sample all layers. I absolutely don't want to do that either. I'm going to come back, just select the white pixel area around the furniture, and just hit delete. And now you can see that the image really emphasizes the furniture. Now, you know, and again, not everybody likes this look, but obviously the aesthetics of your project are going to drive how you produce each of these layers. Now, okay, so that's using the rendered background image. Let me turn that off for a second. There are other simple things that you can do to render your plan. Even if it's just a black and white plan, you can take this layer and add a special layer style called Drop Shadow. And what this does, I'll call up the Drop Shadow menu, it will put what's called a drop shadow, a shadow off to one side of whatever it is that you've selected. Now, this layer, that I have applied this to, I only have the furniture visible. Remember, I deleted the background. So that's how you can get a drop shadow on just the furniture. If I hadn't done that, I would have a drop shadow just on the perimeter of the image because it's looking for basically places where there are no pixels. and that's where it will put the drop shadow. Anyway, there are a number of features that you can control on a drop shadow, and you can actually get quite a nice result here just by playing around with the sliders, and of course the scale of your furniture and the scale of your plan are going to determine to a large extent how you're going to apply that. But that's actually quite a nice way to get a shadow on your plan. Now, let's say that you don't have any rendered layer here. You're just experimenting with different materials, and you want to try I don't know, experiment with maybe wood flooring in parts of your project. One thing that you can do, and let me turn off this layer here. One thing that you can do is look for an image of a wood flooring. And when you search for images, make sure that you use the word seamless for your search term, one of your search terms, whatever it is, if it's tile or ceramic tile or whatever. That seamless texture, if you look carefully, the joint here between the wood matches perfectly with the bottom side. So when this image is kind of copied over on itself multiple times, it will basically not look like there are any joints whatsoever. Now there are some unrealistic parts about this. For instance, the wood flooring could end up being really, really long because there's no limit to it. Anyway, if you select this image, open the image in Photoshop, select everything in the image, you can go to the Edit menu and choose Define Pattern. And defining a pattern, it'll ask you for the name, and I'll call it wood flooring, I don't know, number 1. And what that means, let me go back to my plan. If I want to paint an area of my drawing, here's my paint bucket. Normally it paints whatever the foreground color is, so I could come in here, and paint this area red. Oh, except I need to be on the right layer. And it would paint it red. And what it would do is similar to the magic wand. The part that I click on, as long as contiguous is selected, it will look for any pixels that look just like that one, and it will keep going until it reaches some boundary of a pixel that doesn't look like the one I clicked on, and it will stop at that boundary. Okay. Now, red is not exactly a terribly nice color, and what I want to do, if I'm going to paint kind of manually a floor plan area, what I'll do, I'll make a new layer first. I'm just going to click the Create New Layer button down on the lower right of my screen. And I could even call that flooring or something like that. The reason I want to do that is now when I use the paint bucket, and let's say I go and do the same operation here, I'll check this All Layers button up top. Now I'll paint, my paint will land on this flooring layer, but it will look for boundaries on all layers. There's a whole lot of layers, only one of them is on. Either way, I end up with the same result, but now I can turn on and off the paint layer or fiddle around with its opacity or apply filters or other fun things to it. Okay, now actually I really don't want to paint it red, so let me paint it another color. And basically, normally it paints the foreground color. I can paint it a pattern. Right up here in the top bar menu, I can choose the option. There are a whole number of patterns that are kind of already in Photoshop, and you can go and there's all sorts of pattern libraries that you can get. Anyway, when you add a new pattern, I just created one with this wood. I can click on it and it becomes something I can paint into my space. Now, probably it's going to not be the right size. Like when I click that, to scale, that looks probably a little wide, I would have to guess. I don't have my graphic scale, but those boards look a little wide to me. So I could just paint on this layer if I knew it was the right size. If not, what I can do is select the area I want to paint. Oh, and make sure I have sample all layers. And then I can create a new layer called a pattern layer. And what it will do is it will use whichever pattern I choose. But now, because I'm a little, I think it's a little too big, I can change the scale to be a little bit smaller. This is probably more like your typical oak strip flooring. I can also link it to other layers and make it snap to an origin or other places like that. But either way, when I do this, now I have this wood flooring that I have painted at the right scale. It's on a separate layer, so as before, I have my controls over opacity. If I want to tone it down just a tad, I can erase part of it, erase a feathered selection. And of course, I can turn back on some of the other elements, such as my furniture with the lovely dropped shadow. Another fun technique that you can do, this is a very photorealistic technique. Some of you are more artsy-fartsy. You can look for seamless images of things like watercolor. Select it all, Command A or Control A. And go like we did before and define a new pattern. And then when you go to your plan drawing, maybe you select an area and you paint it with that cool watercolor. And again, you just go to the paint bucket, wherever that is, and you choose the pattern that you created. And like before, I'm not going to paint directly. I'm going to use this special pattern adjustment layer with the area pre-selected. And that way I have the option to fiddle around with the scale, because you just never know what's going to look good. Sometimes really big actually looks kind of nice. It has this very artsy-fartsy effect. It does look a little funny with such a sharp edge to it. Like before, I could try to come in here and fiddle around with the opacity, maybe make it look a little softer. But another technique, if I want to try and use that selective deletion option, where I select an area, and maybe I try to delete the perimeter here. The way that I did that last time, I chose feather, choose some radius. 50 is probably good for something like this. Right now, that's selecting the middle. I want to actually select the inverse so that now this area here is selected. Again, just right-click on it to select it. But the problem is it won't let me do it. If I hit the delete button, see this message pops up. It's because this is a special adjustment layer. What I need to do is right-click on the layer and choose Rasterize. And this will basically flatten the layer so that it's easier to modify. And now I can just hit the delete button and it softens that edge. Maybe that's not perfect, but it does kind of give you a more artsy effect. One last little flourish that you can add to your floor plan is to add, say, a drop shadow or poche to your walls. Adding drop shadow is basically the same as we did before with the furniture. The trick is find your walls layer, and you're going to want to delete the floor area, because if I just make a drop shadow on this layer now, go to layer style, drop shadow, nothing happens because it treats this whole thing as one giant image, so there's probably a drop shadow way down at the bottom. What I need to do is delete areas of the floor or even the outside that I think should have a shadow on them. I'll just select them, delete them, and you can see here this crosshatch pattern, kind of checkerboard pattern in the background. That's Photoshop's way of telling you that there are no pixels in those areas. Now, when I go and I apply the drop shadow, again, layer style, drop shadow, I should see a nice shadow showing up. And again, you can change any number of features about it, make it darker, bigger, etc., etc. Change the angle. That's a very nice feature. And of course, when you add back in the furniture, the shadow goes on top, or add in the flooring, the shadow goes on top of that, depending on your layer stacking, of course. The other thing that I think looks really nice is adding poche to the walls. And of course, you can poche black or white or some hatch pattern. The big thing is creating a new layer first. Just like I did before, make sure it's on top of the plan layer. It's not absolutely critical. We can change blending modes and things to make it look right. But then when you're on the new layer, use your paint bucket. And again, make sure, as we did before, that in this case, all layers is selected. Now, the only trick, and this is often a point of confusion, you might think that this, having the drippy part of the paint bucket over your wall, will paint it. But in fact, it does not do that. What it does, it's the cursor, the actual pointer part, not the dumpy part of the bucket. So you can see now I can click using just the tip of the cursor, and I can fill in those walls quite easily. And as before, because this is on a separate layer, I can tweak down the opacity, or I could even make this a color rather than gray or black and white. So that's a really nice way to gussy up your floor plan and make it read a little bit better. If all else fails, put that graphic scale on the plan and you won't have a problem. If you absolutely get to Photoshop and you just can't remember what the image size should be, you can go to the image pull down menu and choose image size. And what this will tell you here is at 300 pixels per inch, this image is 21 inches wide. Now, if you remembered when you exported your drawing from SketchUp, the size that makes the most sense, then of course you're all set. If you exported it by using a virtual printer and printing to a PDF file, that PDF, if you set everything up to scale, should retain the correct size in this image. If you did it the way I did it, and this is probably the most common way, just by using the export menu, I need to do a quick calculation to figure out how big this drawing should be. You know, if this plan is about, say, 40 feet long at 1/4 inch scale, well, 40 feet at 1/4 inch, the drawing should be 10 inches long. Okay, so you can take your architect scale and look at it. So what I would want to do is then make sure that I change the size of this image, and usually I leave this resample button off because it will mess around with things. I don't want to lose any pixels. But if I know the image should be, say, 10 inches wide, just come and change it, and it will resize the image to be the correct size at whatever resolution it ends up being. So now if I import this image into, say, a page layout program like InDesign, it should be just fine. Again, the trick is make sure you understand what size it's supposed to be and get that graphic scale in there just in case math isn't your forte. Anyway, this technique can be used on any sort of drawing, including perspective drawings, and elevations, sections, reflected ceiling plans. There are any number of drawings that could benefit from this simple rendering technique. Just make sure you get the different layers exported out of your modeling software.